Step off the track.
I'm working here. What is
Like the
happening?
overtime you billed from a bowling alley for 2 years.
Once is a mistake. Twice is suspicious. Thomas Caputo did this thousands of times over multiple years and left a paper trail for every single one. By the time this footage ends, he will have answered for all of it.
That's how this whole place runs. They build the schedule so you have to
3,800
pad it.
hours you never worked,
The
Thomas.
supervisor signed off on everything. It's not my fault.
He would not get the chance to explain. Within months, federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York would lay out a multi-year scheme that paid him almost $500,000 in a single calendar year. In 2018, the Long Island Railroad paid Thomas Caputo $461,000. That was more than the chairman of the entire Metropolitan Transportation Authority earned. He was a track inspector. He was supposed to be on the rails. Federal investigators would prove he was somewhere else entirely. Quick question before we keep going. You ride a train, a bus, a subway, anything public. How often do you actually think about the person who is paid to make sure that thing does not kill you? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you are new here, subscribe. We cover the cases that should be on the nightly news and somehow never are. Thomas Caputo was born in Queens in 1965, the second son of a sheet metal foreman who had spent his own working life in the rail yards of Sunnyside, and a stay-at-home mother who clipped coupons at the kitchen table on Saturday mornings. His father came home with grease on his forearms and the same story every Friday. The railroad was a job for life. You got in, you put your head down, you took the overtime when they offered it, and you retired with a pension that meant something. That was the gospel of the Caputo household. The family moved out to Massapequa Park when Tommy was 11. His father wanted a lawn, a driveway, and a station on the Babylon branch he could ride into the city. The house was a small split level on a street where every other neighbor worked some kind of public job. Cops, firemen, sanitation, a few transit guys. The block had a rhythm. The men left before sunrise and came home with pension talk, and the wives kept lists of birthdays on the fridge. Tommy was an average student at Massapequa High School. His report cards used words like punctual and cooperative. A guidance counselor wrote in 1982 that he was mechanically inclined and well-suited to a hands-on trade. He played JV baseball one year and quit. He worked summers at an auto body shop on Sunrise Highway, sanding fenders and learning how to talk to grown men in a garage. By his senior year, he had already filled out a Long Island Railroad application and walked it into the personnel office at Hillside himself, in a borrowed sport coat that did not quite fit in the shoulders. He started at the LIRR in 1984. He was 19 years old. His starting position was track helper, the entry-level job in the maintenance of way department, and his first paycheck was for $186 and change after taxes. He brought it home and showed it to his father, who folded it once, handed it back, and said only, "Do not blow it." Tommy did not blow it. He saved. He bought a used Chevy pickup, paid cash, and opened his first union savings account at the credit union in Jamaica. The work was brutal in a way that built people. Track helpers spent their days swinging sledgehammers, replacing rotted wooden ties, and breathing creosote in the summer heat. In winter, they shoveled snow off switches at 3 a.m. while their fingers turned white inside their gloves. Tommy did it for 6 years. His attendance was nearly perfect. His supervisors marked him as dependable and willing to take extra shifts. That last phrase would appear on his evaluations every year for the next 3 decades. In 1990, he married Diane, a girl he had known since freshman algebra, in a small ceremony at a catering hall in Bethpage. They bought a ranch house in Wantagh in 1993, 15 minutes from the Wantagh station on the Babylon branch. 2 sons followed. By 1996, he had been promoted to track inspector, a position that paid more, demanded more, and put him alone on the rails with a clipboard for 8 to 10 hours at a stretch. He was 31 years old. He had a pension building. He had a house. He had 2 boys. He had everything his father had described on those Friday nights in Queens. For the next 20 years, Tommy Caputo was exactly the man the LIRR thought he was. He showed up. He took the call-outs at 4 in the morning. He inspected miles of track in nor'easters and heat waves. His supervisors gave him the same 3 notes year after year. Dependable, mechanically sound, willing to work overtime when others would not. The last note mattered. The railroad ran on overtime. The railroad had always run on overtime. The men who said yes to the extra hours were the men who got the better assignments, the day shifts, the holidays off when they finally wanted them. Tommy said yes to everything. His co-workers called him Tommy OT. It was not entirely a compliment. It was the kind of nickname that meant a man was reliable, but also that a man was always there, always reaching for the time card, always padding the check. In the locker room at the Hillside Maintenance Facility in Queens, it was something men said with a half smile and a small shake of the head. Tommy heard it. Tommy did not mind. By 2010, his W-2 was clearing $200,000. By 2015, it was clearing $300,000, and no one upstairs ever once asked him a question. To understand what Tommy Caputo did, you have to understand what the Long Island Railroad actually is. The LIRR is the busiest commuter railroad in North America. On a normal weekday before the pandemic, it moved more than 300,000 passengers across 124 stations and 700 miles of track, stretching from Penn Station out to the easternmost tip of Long Island. It is run by the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, a public benefit corporation funded by ticket revenue, taxes paid by every working person in the New York region, and dedicated state and federal subsidies. The MTA's annual operating budget exceeds $17 billion. Every cent of it is, in some form, public money. Track inspectors are the railroad's safety net. Federal Railroad Administration regulations require that every section of mainline track be physically inspected at least twice a week, on foot or by high rail truck, by a qualified inspector. They look for broken rails, loose joint bars, cracked welds, washed out ballast, defective switches, and any one of 100 small failures that can derail a 6-car commuter train moving at 79 miles an hour. The job is real. People die when the job is not done. Every commuter on the 642 out of Wantagh is alive, in part because somebody walked that track the night before. That is the trust at the center of the role. A track inspector says he was on the rails. The railroad believes him. The riders believe him. The state believes him. The federal government believes him. There is no supervisor walking 10 feet behind him with a stopwatch. There is no time clock embedded in the gravel. He writes down the hours. He signs the report. The railroad pays him. The overtime system at the LIRR was its own special invitation. The contract Caputo worked under paid time and a half for any hour beyond his 40-hour week and double time on Sundays and certain holidays. For decades, the union and management had agreed that overtime was the way urgent work got done. A washed-out section of track after a hurricane. A broken switch at 5 in the morning. A signal failure during the evening rush. Somebody had to be there, and the contract said that somebody got paid handsomely for being there. But the verification of those hours was almost entirely on the honor system. There were access card readers at the maintenance facility, but inspectors were often legitimately out on the line where no card reader existed. There were daily inspection reports, but those reports were filled out by the inspector himself. There were supervisors, but each one oversaw a wide territory and could not be at every joint of track at every hour. The railroad had built a system that depended on the moral character of its workforce. For most of the workforce, that worked. For Tommy Caputo, it became an opportunity that grew larger every year. The first fraudulent overtime hour Thomas Caputo billed is impossible to date precisely. Federal investigators believe the pattern began at least as early as 2014 and intensified each year as he tested the limits of the system and found that no limit existed. By 2016, his annual compensation crossed $300,000. By 2017, it cleared $400,000. By 2018, it had become something the auditors would later describe as mathematically impossible for a single human being to have worked. In 2018, his peak year, the MTA paid Caputo approximately $461,000. His base salary was around $117,000. The remaining $344,000 was overtime. He claimed 3,864 overtime hours that year on top of 1,682 regular hours. The two numbers added together come to 5,546 hours of work in a single calendar year. A calendar year contains 8,760 hours total, including the time a human being is sleeping. To have actually worked the hours Caputo claimed, he would have had to be on the rails an average of 15.2 hours every single day of the year, including weekends, holidays, every Christmas morning, every Easter Sunday, every birthday. He never took a day off. He never got sick. He never sat down to dinner. He never slept more than 9 hours in any 24-hour stretch. And on those 9 sleeping hours, he was, according to his own timesheets, an inspector on duty for an average of 10 of them. The mechanics were almost embarrassing in their simplicity. Caputo would sign up for overtime shifts at the assignment board at Hillside. He would sometimes show up. He would sometimes show up briefly and then leave. He would sometimes not show up at all. In every case, regardless of what actually happened, he would later file paperwork claiming the full overtime hours, write up inspection reports, and submit them up the chain. The reports went into the system. The hours went into payroll. The check followed 2 weeks later. He was not alone. The MTA Inspector General would later identify a loose ring of LIRR and New York City Transit employees engaged in the same kind of fraud. The ring collectively pulled more than $1 million in fraudulent overtime. 2 of the names that came up alongside Caputo's were John Nugent, a fellow LIRR worker, and Joseph Balestra, also LIRR. They covered for one another. They signed off on one another's bogus reports. They built a small culture inside the maintenance department where the question was not whether the time was real, but whether anyone upstairs was paying attention. The lifestyle the money paid for did not look like the lifestyle of a man getting rich. That was part of the genius of it, and part of the eventual problem. Tommy Caputo did not buy a boat. He did not buy a vacation home. He did not move to a bigger house. He stayed in the same Wantagh ranch, drove the same Ford pickup that his neighbors saw in the driveway, and took the same modest summer trips with Diane and the boys to a rental cottage on the North Fork. He paid down his mortgage. He paid for both sons to go to college. He maxed out his pension contributions. He banked the rest. To the neighbors, he was just a hard-working railroad guy who never seemed to be home. To the IRS, his returns showed an income that no one on the block came close to matching, but no one on the block ever saw those returns. What he did spend money on, almost obsessively, was bowling. He had bowled since he was a teenager. He had carried an average over 200 for most of his adult life. He owned 3 custom bowling balls, drilled to his hand by a pro shop in Levittown. He bowled in 2 leagues at AMF Wantagh Lanes, sometimes 3. He bowled on Tuesday nights, Wednesday nights, Sunday afternoons. He bowled in regional tournaments. He bought leather bowling bags. He bought specialty wrist supports. He bowled the way other men golf. It was the one place outside of work where Tommy Caputo was completely, visibly himself, and it was the one place that would eventually destroy him. The unraveling began in 2018, the same year his fraudulent earnings hit their peak. That year, an internal MTA report flagged something that even the agency's own leadership could not ignore. The single highest paid employee in the entire Metropolitan Transportation Authority that year was not the chairman. It was not a senior vice president. It was not a chief operating officer. It was a track inspector in Wantagh named Thomas Caputo. He had out-earned the chairman of the agency by more than $70,000. The number leaked. By December 2018, the Empire Center for Public Policy in Albany had published its annual database of public employee salaries, and the New York Post and Newsday picked up the story within a week. The headline practically wrote itself. A track inspector making nearly $500,000 in a city where the trains were chronically late. Riders who were paying $16 for a peak-hour ticket from Wantagh to Penn Station found out that one of the men responsible for keeping them alive on that ride had made more than the chairman. Public outrage moved quickly. The MTA chairman at the time, who had been quietly considering retirement, was suddenly being asked by reporters how a track inspector had out-earned him. The governor's office issued a statement demanding accountability. The MTA Inspector General announced a formal investigation. The United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, working with the FBI, opened a parallel federal probe within weeks. What separated the Caputo case from 100 other public payroll scandals that year was that the investigators did not stop at the number. They did not write an op-ed and move on. They built a forensic reconstruction of his hours. They wanted to know, hour by hour, where Thomas Caputo had actually been when he claimed to be on the rails. They did not have to guess. The modern world is built out of records. A man moves through it, leaving a trail of card swipes, cell tower pings, receipts, and security camera frames. All you have to do is line them up against his timesheet. We are about to walk through how federal investigators caught him, not by an audit, not by a whistleblower, by stacking his own digital footprint against his own time card. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe and hit the bell. We cover the cases that prove there is no such thing as getting away with it forever. The MTA Inspector General's office, working in concert with FBI special agents assigned to the SDNY Public Corruption Unit, began the reconstruction in early 2019. The team pulled 4 categories of records and laid them across one another, like transparencies on a light table. First, the access card data. Every time Thomas Caputo swiped his employee ID at any MTA facility on Long Island or in Queens, the time and location were logged in a central database. Investigators pulled 3 years of swipes. They cross-referenced every swipe against his self-reported timesheets. The gaps were enormous. Caputo had reported being on the clock for thousands of hours, during which his card never registered at any MTA property at all. Second, the cell phone records. Federal subpoenas compelled his wireless carrier to produce call detail records and tower ping data for every minute of his claimed working hours. Cell phones do not have to be on a call to leave a trace. Every few minutes, they reach out to the nearest tower and announce themselves. Investigators built a map of every tower Caputo's phone had touched, and they overlaid it on the map of LIRR track he had supposedly been inspecting. Long stretches of his claimed inspection routes had no corresponding phone activity in those locations. His phone, and presumably the man carrying it, were consistently somewhere else. Third, the receipts. Investigators pulled credit card and debit card transactions, ATM withdrawals, and gas station purchases. They mapped the locations. They found him at diners on Sunrise Highway during overtime hours. They found him at home improvement stores. They found him at a gas station in Bay Shore at the exact moment his timesheet said he was inspecting track 12 miles away in Hicksville. Fourth, and most damaging, the bowling alley records. AMF Wantagh Lanes was a corporate bowling center. Like every modern lane house, it ran on a computer system that tracked everything: league sign-ins, lane assignments, frame-by-frame scoring, timestamps for every game played. When investigators subpoenaed those records, they did not just receive a list of nights Tommy Caputo had bowled. They received a minute-by-minute reconstruction of where he had stood, which lane he had used, what he had scored, and how long he had been there. The records covered the same 3 years investigators were already examining. The overlay was devastating. On Tuesday nights, Wednesday nights, Sunday afternoons, and dozens of weekday evenings, Caputo's MTA timesheet showed him on the rails inspecting track. His bowling alley records showed him at AMF Wantagh, mid-game, 240 pin score, beer on the scorer's table. The 2 records described the same man in 2 different places at the same minute of the same day. One of them was a lie. The investigators built a single chart. On the chart, every fraudulent overtime hour was a red line. The chart looked like a city after dark. 3,864 red lines for 2018 alone. They did not need to prove every single one. They only needed to prove enough to demonstrate the scheme. They had hundreds of hours dead to rights on multiple corroborating records, with bowling alley video footage to anchor the worst of them. By summer 2019, the MTA Inspector General's office had referred the case to federal prosecutors. By that fall, a federal grand jury in the Southern District of New York had begun hearing evidence. The same forensic process was repeated for John Nugent, Joseph Balestra, and several other LIRR and transit workers. The ring came apart one node at a time. Each man, when shown his own data, made some version of the same calculation. He could fight a case in which his own timesheet was contradicted by his own phone, his own card, his own receipts, and his own bowling score. Or he could plead. The federal interview happened in a conference room at the FBI's Long Island offices in Melville. Tommy Caputo came in voluntarily with his attorney on a Tuesday morning in early 2020. He was 55 years old. He wore a navy sport coat and pressed khakis. His hair had gone fully gray over the previous year. He sat down across from two FBI special agents and an assistant United States attorney and asked, before they began, whether he could get a cup of coffee. The first hour was background, where he had grown up, how long he had been at the LIRR, what his job duties were. He answered every question politely. He used the words, "Yes, sir," and "No, sir," and "to the best of my recollection." His attorney sat beside him and watched. Then the prosecutor opened a folder. Inside the folder was the chart. Prosecutor: Mr. Caputo, I'd like to show you your overtime claims for calendar year 2018. You reported 3,864 hours of overtime on top of your regular schedule. Does that number look correct to you? Caputo: If that's what the timesheets say, sir. Prosecutor: It is what the timesheets say. You filed them. Caputo: Then yes, sir. Prosecutor: That's an average of more than 10 hours of overtime per day, every day, 365 days a year, including Christmas, Easter, the 4th of July, your wedding anniversary, and your son's birthdays. Did you really work those hours, Mr. Caputo? Caputo shifted in his seat. He looked at his attorney. His attorney said nothing. He looked back at the prosecutor. Caputo: I worked a lot of overtime. Everybody does the overtime. That's how the railroad is. That's how it's always been. The prosecutor turned the page. Prosecutor: Mr. Caputo, I'd like to walk you through Tuesday, October 9th, 2018. Your timesheet for that day shows you on overtime track inspection between 6 p.m. and 1 a.m. We pulled your access card records. Your card did not enter or exit any MTA property that evening. We pulled your cell phone records. Your phone was in Wantagh the entire evening. We pulled records from AMF Wantagh lanes. You bowled 3 games on lane 4 between 7:15 and 9:42 p.m. You scored 224, 231, and 218. Can you explain that to me, sir? Caputo did not speak for a moment. His face changed, not dramatically, just a small tightening around the eyes. Caputo: I might have stopped in. Prosecutor: For 3 games, with a 224 average, while billing the MTA for inspecting track. Caputo: I worked those hours, sir. I made up the time. Prosecutor: You made up 7 hours of track inspection between leaving the bowling alley at 9:42 p.m. and 1 a.m. Mr. Caputo, that's 3 hours and 18 minutes. You billed for 7. His attorney finally spoke. He asked for a recess. When they came back, Tommy Caputo did not answer many more questions. The interview ended within the hour. His attorney took him out a side door. 2 months later, on advice of counsel, Thomas Caputo pleaded guilty to 1 count of conspiracy to commit federal program fraud, a violation of Title 18 of the United States Code. He stood in front of a federal judge in Lower Manhattan and admitted, on the record, that he had knowingly billed the MTA for hours he had not worked. The sentencing took place at the Daniel Patrick Moynihan United States Courthouse in Lower Manhattan. The courtroom was full. Reporters from Newsday, the New York Post, the Daily News, and the local NBC, CBS, and ABC affiliates filled 3 rows. a handful of LIRR riders had come on their own time and sat in the back. The government's sentencing memorandum laid out the scheme in clinical detail. Caputo had defrauded the MTA of more than $100,000 over the years, for which prosecutors had built ironclad evidence, with the actual loss likely far higher across the full span of the conspiracy. He had been one of multiple co-conspirators in a ring that had collectively defrauded the public of more than $1 million. He had not just stolen money, he had stolen safety hours. Every hour he had billed without performing was an hour during which the public believed someone was inspecting the rails that their children rode to school. His defense attorney spoke for almost an hour. He talked about Tommy Caputo, the boy from Queens, the 35 years of service, the clean disciplinary record before this case, the 2 sons, the mortgage, the aging mother in Massapequa Park. He acknowledged the conduct, but asked the court to consider the man who had stood up for the union, helped train younger inspectors, never had a drinking problem, never been arrested for anything in his life. He asked for a sentence of probation. He asked for community service. He asked the court to recognize that Thomas Caputo had been raised inside a culture at the LIRR, where overtime was the unspoken currency of the workforce, and where, the attorney suggested with careful language, supervisors had looked the other way for decades. Then the prosecutor stood up. The prosecutor did not speak for long. The prosecutor pointed out, very calmly, that Caputo had billed the MTA for time spent at a bowling alley while 300,000 New Yorkers per day rode trains that he had sworn under oath he had inspected. The prosecutor noted that the chairman of the entire MTA had made less money in 2018 than the defendant had. The prosecutor asked the court to send a message. The judge took 15 minutes to read his ruling. He addressed Caputo directly. He used the phrase that would end up in every news story written about the case that night. What this defendant orchestrated, the judge said, looking down from the bench, was an orgy of overtime fraud carried out on an epic scale. He did not steal a single hour. He did not steal 100 hours. He stole thousands of hours, hours that were paid for by every taxpayer in the state of New York, hours that were supposed to be spent inspecting the very rails on which the public's lives depended. The notion that the defendant has put forward, that this conduct was somehow normal at the railroad, is not a defense. It is an aggravation. If the culture at the LIRR was as Mr. Caputo's counsel describes, then he is one of the architects of that culture, not its victim. The judge sentenced Thomas Caputo to 8 months in federal prison. The judge ordered restitution in the amount of $109,641.74. The judge imposed 3 years of supervised release upon his return to the community. Caputo was designated to a low-security federal prison camp. He surrendered on the date the court set. His co-defendants received their own sentences in the months that followed. John Nugent was sentenced to 5 months in federal custody. Joseph Balestra was sentenced to 3 months. Several other LIRR and transit employees pleaded out to lesser charges and received probation or short stretches of home confinement. The MTA Inspector General's office continued its broader review of overtime fraud at the agency for years afterward. The agency overhauled its overtime verification systems, installed GPS tracking on high rail trucks, and tightened access card requirements for time-and-a-half claims. Tommy Caputo served his 8 months. He returned home to Wanta in the same ranch house, with the same pickup, with the same wife. The pension he had built across 35 years was reduced but not eliminated, as is often the case with federal pleas of this type. He did not return to the railroad. He could not. His name had become the example everyone inside the MTA used to describe what happens to inspectors who bowl on the clock. The riders on the 642 out of Wanta kept getting on the train every morning, the same way they always had. Most of them never thought about who had walked the track the night before and what that person had really been doing. That trust, the same trust Tommy Caputo had quietly drained for years, was the only thing keeping any of it moving. This case was almost cartoonish in the size of the number and the absurdity of the smoking gun. But the next case on the right-hand side is darker, smaller, and much harder to forget. Click it now.